Bombs are being placed in mosques, and a major Islamic organisation says British Muslims are living in fear. Is that because of an unfair portrayal of Muslims in the media? Are Muslims being demonised? Good morning, I'm Samira Ahmed. Welcome to Sunday Morning Live. Also on today's programme, Jesus kicked money changers out of the temple, but this week the Archbishop of Canterbury said the church should invite lenders in. Is banking becoming morally bankrupt? And as the Pope welcomes 2 million young pilgrims to a gathering on Copacabana Beach in Brazil, we examine whether pilgrimage is still relevant. My guests this week are Douglas Murray, a journalist and author. In his latest book, Islamophilia, he argues that we are far too reluctant to criticise Islam. Novelist and broadcaster Anne Atkins, who's also the wife of a vicar, knows more than most about church finances. And Mehdi Hassan, who is the political director of Huffington Post UK, says he's an obsessive tweeter. We want to know what you think. If you have a webcam, you can join us via Skype. You can also give your views on Twitter or by phone. Phone calls cost up to 5p a minute from most landlines, and calls from mobiles may cost considerably more. Texts will be charged at your standard message rate. Many in the Muslim community in Britain say they've become alarmed at what they call an unprecedented escalation of violence following the backlash after the murder of drummer Lee Rigby in May. There has been an increase in reported hate crime, and in the last 5 weeks there have been 3 bomb attacks on mosques. This week, the Muslim Council of Britain wrote to the Home Secretary calling for a coordinated national response. They said it cannot be right that a minority community is allowed to be targeted in this manner. The government says it takes any such attacks very seriously, but some Muslims say the planting of bombs is only symptomatic of a deeper problem in our society. Are Muslims treated differently to other minorities? Douglas Murray thinks we're far too soft on Islam. We'll hear his views in a moment. But first, Mehdi Hassan with his Sunday Stand.
I love this country, and as a Muslim in particular, I wouldn't want to live anywhere else. But the sad fact is that these days, in Britain, you can say things about Islam and about Muslims that you cannot say about any other minority. Imagine if you picked up a newspaper to discover the headline, "Christmas is banned, it offends Jews." Or perhaps if you read, "Gay plot to kill the Pope." Or even, "Black people tell us how to run our schools." You'd be shocked, I hope. Outraged even. But change the words Jew, gay and black to Muslim, and these become very real headlines that have appeared on the front pages of our national newspapers. The truth is that the negative stereotyping, the outright demonisation of what I would say is a pretty powerless and voiceless minority is now out of control. It's especially evident online, where anti-Muslim prejudice and bigotry flourishes, in the blogosphere and on Twitter and Facebook. Take it from someone who's had to deal with a lot of it. Look, this isn't about Islamic beliefs being given special treatment or protection from criticism, of course not. It's about Muslims being treated no differently to other minorities. It's about equal treatment, not fear-mongering. Yes, there's a terror threat that has to be tackled, but the actions of a tiny minority of extremists shouldn't be used to smear the entire Muslim community or the religion of Islam as a whole. Remember, portraying Muslims as different or even dangerous has serious repercussions on community relations. In the wake of drummer Lee Rigby's murder in Woolwich, anti-Muslim attacks quadrupled in number. At least 25 mosques have since been attacked, 3 of them with bombs. We urgently need to change the way we talk and write about Islam and Muslims. Believe me when I tell you this, we Muslims are not endowed with magically thicker skins than everyone else.
Well, that's the view of Mehdi Hassan. What do you think? Are Muslims expected to have thicker skin than the rest of society, or are they just overly sensitive? Douglas?
Well, I don't think Muslims are expected to have thicker skin, but they're not expected and shouldn't be expected to have thinner skin either. I think it's very important to make sure, of course, at the outset, nobody should demonize any group of people because of the actions of some individuals, however large or small within the community. But where Mehdi says you wouldn't hear these headlines, for instance, being written about anyone else, if gays or Jews or any other minority had within their number people who had carried out terrorist attacks, who had decapitated people, who had blown up tubes and buses, I think we would read those headlines.
Right, well, that is the question for our text vote. Are Muslims being demonised? Text the word vote, followed by yes or no to 81771, and texts will be charged at your standard message rate. You can only vote once, so go online to vote for free, and results will be announced at the end of the show. And visit bbc.co.uk/Sunday Morning Live, where you can also read full terms and conditions. You know, you say that it's not about demonising anyone, but the scale of these attacks being reported does suggest that there is a unique problem, and most Muslims, Mehdi saying, are powerless, and you know they're finding themselves victims of a backlash. I'm
not sure Muslims in this country are more powerless than anyone else. I mean, lots of people feel themselves to be voiceless. Some Muslims, I'm sure, among them. But the idea that, first of all, it's very important. You said at the outset, you know, in the wake of the murder of drummer Lee Rigby, there's backlash. We shouldn't, first of all, lose sight of the fact that the murder of drummer Lee Rigby was a major thing.
There's an active case, which is why we can't talk about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But and now there seems to have been a backlash against that, and it obviously has to be said that anybody who takes out the action of a minority on a group as a whole has to be condemned. If people think that the reaction to something like that should be to commit violence against any individual or to do any act of violence, of course that's wrong. Of course that's wrong.
Mehdi, there is this concern about oversensitivity and that you can separate off individual acts from the fact that there are questions for Islam to answer.
Well, Islam is not a person doesn't answer anything. I think Muslims can answer questions about things that are going on in the community. Of course they should. And I've written articles about things that the Muslim community needs to tackle in its midst. There's no one's denying that at all. I think a couple of things in response to Douglas. Number one, we could talk about Woolwich and make that a peg.
But we
obviously,
can't talk about
well, you know what I mean in terms of chronologically,
way.
We can say before or after Woolwich. But you know, Mohammed Salim, 75-year-old pensioner who was murdered walking outside of a mosque.
Unfortunately, there is an active case.
Indeed,
because
but he was murdered.
charged.
I can say he was murdered. That happened a month before the Woolwich attacks. Attacks on Muslims and on mosques have been going on for years. The media headlines I talked about in my film were pretty much all pre-Woolwich. As for the point about terrorists in our midst, fine, let's talk about terrorism. But what I'm talking about is stories about halal meat, stories about Muslim women's clothing, stories about Sharia law, stories about, you know, when the Mail on Sunday runs 2 weeks running exposés of halal meat in our schools, that has nothing to do with 7/7 or Woolwich or 9/11. That has to do with portraying Muslims as different, scary, the
I just want to ask Anne, I mean, are these legitimate questions, or is there implicit idea that somehow it's racism masquerading as something else?
I mean, yes, I think Muslims are being demonised, I think, without question. Your film, Mehdi, was very powerful. I have the misfortune to be on the email list of a friend of mine. I mean, he's a very good friend of mine, and I receive stuff that he sends out every sort of month or two, and some of this stuff is appallingly anti-Muslim, and it isn't really even anti-Muslim, it's sheer racism masquerading. I mean, I'll give you one example, and a lot of it comes from America, I have to say, via, you know, people's email. But we were in America a few years ago as a family, and we were staying with this lovely American family, and over dinner, one of them said to us, what about all this problem with Muslims in your country then? And we said, what problem with Muslims in our country? And he said, well, they're all terrorists, aren't they? I mean, you know, that is an appalling equation that is there in a lot of people's minds. It's confusing Asian Muslim terrorist all in this sort of muddled thing.
But it's encouraged, unfortunately, by some sections of the media.
Well, yes,
so
but there is another side to this. I mean, a lot of what you were saying, interestingly, in your film, I know Christians would say the same, that you can attack Christians in the way that you can't attack any other faith in this country. And there are ways in which... I mean, for instance, here's an example. Sometime, I mean, I think it was over 10 years, 15 years ago, Ian McKellen tore out bits of the Bible because he's saying they're anti-gay, right? Now, no Christian is going to say, you know, right, this guy's got to be assassinated. You couldn't do that with the Quran. Now, in some ways you couldn't because our different faiths are different, and the Quran for Muslims, as I understand it, is different from, you know, it is holy in itself.
But
whereas the Bible, you know,
that response, isn't there? Which is underlying a lot of the concern is the idea that there's a special treatment that's required for Muslims and an oversensitivity. I mean, Douglas, how do you view it?
Well, of course there is. I mean, Mehdi mentioned the level of abuse you say you get on Twitter and the blogosphere. And I don't deny that. The blogosphere, Twitter sphere are very ugly places where people show themselves in a very ugly light. And I think that's the case with all sorts of things. But I would say to Mehdi, he should compare his responses on the Twitter sphere or the blogosphere to anyone who's ever criticised Islam, the Quran, Muhammad, and see what they get by way of reaction, because it's very, very unsavoury too. And I can assure you that there is a good reason for people to fear that sort of thing, because they have noticed what has happened to critics of Islam across North Africa, across the Middle East, including to other Muslims, and they saw what happened, and they saw what happened, and they saw what happened to Theo van Gogh, and they saw what happened to Salman Rushdie. And in our society, we have to an extent internalised. We have to an extent internalised. Let me finish my point. We have internalised this, and people are right to be fearful of doing that.
Right.
So there is fear in all sorts of directions. Some of it legitimate, some of it not.
Mehdi.
Yes, but the difference, and I take on board what Douglas says, I take on board what Anne says about Christians, and I take on board, the difference is we're talking about a minority community which across Europe, without doubt, is being targeted by a vast array of whatever it is, discriminatory laws, police treatments, far-right parties, media treatment. You cannot compare the two. And Douglas wants to bring up examples. I would say 2 years ago in Norway, we saw what happens when the anti-Muslim hatred and bile and fear-mongering and hysteria reaches a stage where Anders Breivik goes and kills 77 people because he's worried about a Muslim takeover of Europe. In our lifetime,
he didn't target or kill Muslims.
Why do you think he targeted the people he did? Come on, Douglas. Anders Breivik calls himself a crusader against Islam and Muslims. In Srebrenica, in our lifetimes, in the heart of Europe, 8,000 Muslim men and boys were massacred for being Muslim. And you say we're being too sensitive.
Hang on, that's one madman, okay? Just as it's one madman...
there's lots of far-right attacks.
Hang on. But, just as we get one madman in Woolwich who uses the name of Islam, and you get...
Again,
you can't
talk about Woolwich, I'm sorry.
Yes, but you can't equate one person doing something nuts with the whole of...
I'm not at all. I'm saying that words have consequences.
Right, okay, there's one thing...
If we carry on with this dialogue at this kind of heated, hysterical level, where a show about Ramadan becomes Ramading Dong on the front of the Sun.
These have consequences. But then we also shouldn't claim that people are being demonised when they are being treated as equal citizens and rightly as equal citizens.
You think the media treats Muslims
equally to everyone else? I can assure you that the media treats a lot of people very unfairly.
All right, let's come back to this in just a second, Anne and guests in the studio. I would like to bring in Sheikh Dr. Mohammed Al-Hussaini on webcam. He's a counter-extremism expert. And, one of the underlying issues here is there have been a number of convictions over the last few years for terrorism, for jihadist plots, but it is a very tiny number. This isn't, in some ways you could argue, this isn't really a Muslim problem, is it? It's just a problem with a few terrorists of all backgrounds.
Well, I think, with respect, the British people no longer really believe the Islamist peace double discourse from British Muslim leaders. And in place of that, as religious people, we're called to speak truthfully and with integrity and honestly recognise that the literalist, supremacist use and abuse of Scripture by violently extremist Islamist groups to support their actions isn't actually so very different to the same kind of literalist, supremacist readings of the same kind of Scripture by, if you like, sort of mainstream extremist Islamist political groups like the Muslim Council of Britain and Jamaat-e-Islami front organisations like the Islamic Foundation. What's required is a truthful recognition, an honest recognition that Islamic, Jewish, Abrahamic sacred texts in many cases contain some profoundly difficult and sometimes violent verses, in much the same way as Jewish rabbinical scholars over the centuries have mediated and moderated the killing verses, say, in Deuteronomy relating to the conquest of Canaan and consign them to a historic past. Muslim scholars need to do the same work, and we can't do that same work if the nature of our discourse is being limited and controlled by an interfaith or Islamophobia kind of industry.
Mohammed, let me put that to Mehdi. There is a kind of Islamicization industry.
There's an Islamophobia industry, but unlike your guest, I would say it's the people who are out there pushing narratives about clash of civilizations, who are pushing all this nonsense about creeping Sharia law, who are exaggerating the threat from terrorism.
That Mohammed's just described, which is, radical ideologies being promoted.
There are radical ideologies being promoted, but on the other hand, if you talk to a lot of terrorism experts, even people at MI5, they will say that a lot of the roots of this is political as well. To claim it's Islamic is nonsensical because the vast majority, 99.9% of Muslims, both here and abroad, condemn these attacks and don't defend these attacks. And let's be honest, let's be honest, even if there is an Islamic link and the minority of people who are carrying this are doing so in the name of Islam.
Well, they say they're doing it in
well,
the
they
name
say
of
they also
Islam.
say they're doing it for foreign policy purposes. They say lots of things. Even if they are, let's concede that for a moment, which I don't. For argument's sake, that still doesn't justify, as I say, all sorts of scaremongering headlines. Douglas says, you know, oh, it's every community. No, this is particular targeting of Muslims.
As I say,
Douglas,
every study of the media shows in this country.
Okay, let Douglas respond.
Studies of the media, I have to say, can be pulled.
Oh, they're not convenient for your argument. Okay.
No, I know that you'll seize a couple that are convenient for yours.
Well,
I just think that
I
think it's really important to go back to this central point. If from a community, however small or large, a certain number of people come who commit acts of violence that are very, very prominent and cause a lot of upset, a lot of death, a lot of horror, there is going to be a response to that. Now, I think the response... No. I agree with the idea that there is a response to it and that it should include criticism where criticism is legitimate. It should include, as we already have seen in this country, the usual force of the law. I mean, that's what's happened in response to these attacks. There's been a Ukrainian man who's been arrested for these attacks. There was a Somali man who attacked a mosque in Birmingham.
Yep.
You know, we've got to remember there is a legitimate response to this of what people will feel. And then there will be completely wrong things like acts of violence. But just very quickly, the Sheikh makes a very important point on this. There is a risk at the moment that there are people who think, as it were, all Muslims think in a particular way. They all have the same agenda or something like that. The only other people who do think that are the Islamist political parties, some of whom do have prominent representatives and spokespeople in this country, among others, who think that all Muslims should follow their version of Islam. And these two sides are equally wrong.
Okay, just before, and I'm going to get you back in, but I just want to bring in Fayaz Mughal, also joining us on webcam, who's director of Tal Mama, which is an organisation that logs alleged Islamophobic attacks. A lot of the incidents that you get reported to you, Fayaz, I understand, are online. And as we've already heard, there's a lot of extreme talk online. One wonders if there is an exaggeration of the scale of the problem.
Well, there isn't an exaggeration of the scale of the problem because the kind of material you see online, as Mehdi has said, include not only threats or threats to kill, they include consistent harassment of individuals. And when I talk consistent harassment, we are talking about people who make an account, take down an account, target the individual with a separate account. Let's not also forget the fact that Salma Yaqub recently received death threats online, which the police, the West Midlands police, then took arrests or made arrests on. So we're not talking here about some soft words that are said that are, or words that people find very distasteful. We are talking about real threats to individuals and impacts on their lives. And let's talk about some of the impacts. When you have emails, when you have tweets sent to you from people you don't know are sending them to you with threats to kill, they are extremely frightening. You compare that to a street-based account. Here, you don't know who is targeting you. So, let's not hear the voices of those who say, well, they're online, they shouldn't be taken into account. There's also something I wanted to quickly raise.
Sure.
Douglas talks about the issue around Islam and Muslims. Douglas was on record as saying in 2006, conditions for Muslims in Europe must be made harder across the board. Europe must look like a less attractive proposition, and he even suggested the demolishing of mosques in some circumstances. Douglas doesn't realize the scale and the intensity of the problem, and he's one who goes on records to say anyone who monitors Islamophobic incidences is part of an Islamophobic industry. Let me tell him that. There's far easier pieces of work I can do for a living rather than getting personal threats or having threats against our staff than being part of an Islamophobic industry.
Let Douglas respond to that.
Very first of all, Tal Mama, I suspect the reason why Fayez has said this is because Tal Mama was subject to a pretty devastating analysis in the Sunday Telegraph the other week by Andrew Gilligan about their research methods. And I'm sure that Fayez is unhappy about that, but there was legitimate criticism of his points. Secondly, on the case of the things he's said in particular, the things that he quotes, and he well knows this, was said many years ago. I never said that anything should be done that was violent. I said that the way mosques taught and preached violence, they should be shut down. Now, I stand by that, and I don't stand, as Fayez well knows, by the other comments which were made in a very, very angry time, after the 7/7 bombings and after the murder of Theo van Gogh, and when several friends of mine had been chased into hiding and had been attempted to be killed because of their criticism of Islam. We all say things that we get wrong. That was one such occasion. I don't have any pride in that. But just very quickly on this final thing.
Please.
This thing about threats has to be tackled. If Salma Yaqub, I disagree with the Respect Party and Faiz knows that. I don't think that Salma Yaqub or anyone else should be subjected to threats of violence against their person. And I don't think it should happen if it's Salma Yaqub, and I don't think it should happen if it's any other individual, including people like myself.
You've made your point. I would like to just a minute, I want to bring Anne in, because you've heard, it comes back to this issue of threat versus threat. Yeah, but also, in a sense, Douglas was talking about saying stuff in the heat of the moment in the aftermath of another very, very violent incident.
Yeah, I mean, we know the Twitter sphere and the blog sphere is full of complete nutcases. I mean, just in this last week, that very brave woman whose call for women on, on our currency has had the most horrific threats against her. So this does happen to us all. I mean, I don't know what happens to people when they go online, but a lot of them lose their senses. Something I wanted to say on a slightly different issue, I think a lot of very reasonable people, Mardi, are worried about, which is that in this country we rejoice in the fact that we've got freedom of speech, we can criticise one another robustly, we can laugh at each other. This is very much part of our culture and our nation and something we're very proud of. And I think a lot of very reasonable people are worried that Islam has this kind of firewall about it, that you mustn't laugh at. Because do you know what I mean? Because
I
of
totally know what you
cartoons
mean,
that are
and I think Muslims should learn to have more fun.
And
there are a lot of good Muslim comedians out there.
And legitimate criticism.
Agreed.
Just before,
and I engage in that, and I've had those debates myself.
Just before you do, because I just want to bring in one of the contributors before we have time, and you will. Anne Cryer is the former MP for Keighley, and over a long period of time has spoken out on issues about things like the status of women in a mainly Muslim kind of constituency. And what's your perspective on this issue of whether Muslims are being demonised?
Well, unfortunately, I'm a well-meaning Guardian reader, and I don't read the rubbish that the Daily Mail and other newspapers pour out. So I'm not really aware of what's being said. But I mean, if they are demonising Muslims, if they are engaging in Islamophobia, I'm very concerned. But can I also say that over 13 years I fought for the rights of Muslim women in my constituency to choose their own partners, their own husbands. Now, if somebody is going to say to me, if perhaps Nady, I'm not sure what he's going to say, is he going to say, well, this is Islamophobic? Well, I can't agree with him. I was entitled during those 13 years to engage in conversations, in campaigns against forced marriages, and from a certain point in my period of office, I also engaged in arguments about gangs grooming and sexually abusing young girls. Now, again, should I not have done that?
Absolutely. And I'm sorry we'll have to leave it there with you because the phone line has terrible problems. But just for those who didn't hear, and then you can respond, Mehdi, is she's raised this issue that when she tries to criticise real problems that are going on in a Muslim community, you're labelled Islamophobic. And this has been going on for years.
Well, there's a simple test. I mean, look, if you're saying forced marriages are about Islam, then yes, I would say that's Islamophobic because actually Islam doesn't allow forced marriages. And Muslim women are campaigning against forced marriages alongside Anne, as she well knows, across the country. So it's about how you describe it. It's about how you approach the problem without stereotyping whole religions or whole communities. Just to do with the other Anne's point here about Twitter and Facebook, yes, it is an online phenomenon, but it's also a mainstream phenomenon. I mean, Douglas keeps going on about terrorism. We agree terrorism is a blight, we need to discuss it. But, if you look at some of the newspaper stuff, were Muslims, did a council ban Christmas to avoid offending Muslims? No. Did NatWest remove its piggy banks to avoid offending Muslims? No. Did a bus driver order his passengers off the bus so he could pray? No. Turned out to be false. Were Muslims responsible for transport chaos in the Olympics? Not at all. Were Muslims involved in the kidnapping of Madeleine McCann? No. Is Islam responsible for the child? That's Daily Star. Is Islam responsible for the grooming of children? No. But all I'm saying is this is the kind of rubbish that's delivered by the Mail, the Express, the Sun, the Star, even the Times. So what else are you going to expect but negative reactions, people having, genuine good people having fears about Islam? Of course, if they're being fed a diet of falsehoods and fabrications...
You see, there is that fear of offending. Maybe
well,
because we're...
I'm offended when people lie about my faith in national newspaper front pages. religious.
I'm
really
offended.
sorry,
There are-
but
but
we
there
have
are-
to...
but
Doug, just very briefly in a
The
sentence.
point is
Douglas
there
said
are,
military
there
is
are
fine.
legitimate and there are illegitimate criticisms, and most of the legitimate criticisms still get people into trouble. The illegitimate criticisms we can separate out, but people are not wrong. They are not
let him
wrong
finish.
when they look at certain Muslim leaders in this country, including some who have been spoken about
Okay.
today,
But that applies to any faith, Douglas.
including you can see Mehdi saying that some of this stuff online as well. There are lots of things that have been said by prominent Muslims in this country
come on,
that people are worried about, concerned about, and I think
Just
are
as you've
legitimate
defended the
to have.
EDL online.
I have certainly not defended the
if you're gonna bring
EDL
out videos
online.
online, go online and watch you
I've
defending the EDL.
certainly not
Come
defended
on.
the EDL.
Let's
but
leave it
people
there.
can go online
Thank
and
you,
see you
gentlemen.
describing non-Muslims as cattle.
Douglas, Mehdi,
So
and
Muslims
Anne.
can see that.
Thank you all very much.
EDL is a legitimate response.
We'll be coming back to this as our poll
I
questions.
certainly did not
Mehdi
say that.
and Douglas.
Grassroots response.
Thank
that
you
should be
enough.
Mehdi, I certainly did
Our
not
poll
say
is still
that. Correct
open.
yourself.
The question you can hear is very much one that we're debating with real passion in the studio. Are Muslims being demonized? Remember, you can only vote once, and if you think they are, text the word vote followed by yes. If you think they're not, text vote followed by no. Text number is 81771. Text will be charged at your standard message rate, and you have around 20 minutes before the poll closes. Now, this week, the Church of England entered the banking business, sort of, or at least threw open its doors to it. The Archbishop of Canterbury said he wants to put payday lenders like Wonga out of business. Instead, he plans to encourage the expansion of